Thank you very much. There's been a delay due to some Zoom glitches, which we think is symbolic of the difficulty of having a dialogue with China. There always seems to be some obstacles in the room, which really might not have anything to do with us and China or China and us, but just something else altogether. Exogenous shocks, economists would call it. So I wanted to emphasize, and we'll try to take the full half hour now in any case, if the technical people will allow us, that both Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Draghi this morning emphasized that we can't do much without China, and that it's not, Prime Minister Draghi said it's not whether we can work with China on global challenges, but how, and that dialogue was an important part. And I was saying that really our dialogue, which has been going on now for 14 months with a dozen sessions with 15 to 20 people taking part in them from a dozen countries, a total of 50 people overall, have gotten somewhere in terms of understandings and concepts and a kind of thrilling frontier of possibility, if I could put it that way, of the fact that we can actually have a dialogue with China, because Chen Dongqiao is here with us today, but he has been with us throughout this exercise, and others from China as well. And the real purpose of our dialogue is to do two things, I think. One is to be talking with China, not about China. And the second is to involve many, a solid set of other players in the global order in that dialogue. And before I go to the questions to our panelists, which is the most important part of this, I do want to say this, is that one of the conclusions that we've come to is that as you survey the geopolitical landscape and look for where the toxic bilateral relationship between the US and China could be managed, you look at the UN Security Council in New York with the veto power that's there and you conclude no. You look at the G7 and you conclude no, for obvious reasons. It certainly wouldn't be NATO. And in fact, as you survey the landscape, there isn't another platform that could do it, and much less do it as well as we think the G20 can do it. Why is that? Because it's a multiple layered platform. It's a platform of the 20 largest countries and a few more in the international institutions. But within it, a smaller group of nations or leaders or ministers or Sherpas generally lead on the agenda. So you have plurilateral leadership within it of a smaller group of less than 10 of 20 nations plus who drive ambition in G20 summits. That's a good thing. And it happens that China has not only participated in certain years in that plurilateral leadership, certainly in the London summit in 2009 and in the Hangzhou summit in 2016, but other countries are there as well, countries that you wouldn't normally think have to do with. And so there are ways to use the G20 summit as a platform for not only driving the ideas for change, which is so desperately needed in this political moment, but also in the process, incorporating China in a positive way in not only the content, but the leadership of it. So you can begin to deal with the geopolitics implicitly as you're dealing with these other issues. So that's a very important. So we urge you to watch at 17:15 CES time, former Prime Ministers Paul Martin from Canada and Kevin Rudd from Australia, one of whom was a finance minister and one was a foreign minister, not unimportant for this kind of concept of the G20 being both a vehicle for economic coordination and leadership, but also foreign policy relations. So please watch that half an hour after this is over, or less, as the case may be. I want to turn to our most important member, Chen Dongqiao, who is president of the Shanghai Institutes, who's been a stalwart throughout all this, as has each of these panelists, and ask you, Dongqiao, how does this process look from Beijing to you? Is this a realistic opportunity for dialogue that we represent in the ChinaWest dialogue?
Colin, I think that you raised a very important question. I do not know Beijing's official line.
Sure.
But I think I will speak on myself, and my institute is also based in Shanghai. But I think that many of the Chinese scholars value the principles and objectives of the China-West dialogue vision, particularly about its to generate innovative ideas for China-Western or West-China relations that would break the current dynamics of confrontation, conflict, and nationalism and strengthen cooperation. I think that those visions are very important and will be valued, appreciated by many Chinese. Why? Because these days, I think in the past few years actually, if we check those Western mainstream narratives or media or survey, and they always use a lot of very simplified but eye-catching, eyeball-catching tags to describe China's modernization, trajectory of modernization. I think that even the Biden administration, I have to, I will be very frank to say that has not got over its misperception of China's modernization and China's trajectory of the modernization. So Beijing generally reject those kind of tags attached to China, namely authoritarianism or state capitalism, mercantilism, or expansionism, or economic coercion, etc. So you will find so many tags these days used so easily, and has been received, I think, by the mainstream Western narratives of media. So I think the CWD provide a platform of generating, as you said, that generating of those open-minded and innovative ideas about what China's modernization really is and what are its implications to the world. So I think that in order to whether CWD poses a realistic shift, as you said, from Chinese perspective, in which China-Western relationship would enable greater progress than the current arrangements and narratives, I think it's a very meaningful, important step. But that's not enough. Or this kind of a platform is not enough. We need a more a kind of a platforms like this, and we also need a continuous concerted effort to work together to reduce the gap between China and the United States in particular, or China with the Western countries in general on many areas of in our dialogue. Because when we talk about global governance or collective action, we need to first reduce the gap on the understanding of the cooperation, because cooperation is the most important thing. Nowadays, I think that there is huge a perception gap between two sides on how to understand cooperation, how to understand multilateralism. I think that because time is very limited, but I would say that how both sides define cooperation. Are there any kind of preconditions for such kind of cooperation? That's very important. And how to, for instance, or where can the China and the United States or Western countries in general maintain or even expand areas of cooperation in the relationship? I think that they require quite a number of sources of bilateral relationship, such as how to cultivate a common or shared cognitive basis, how to build up a domestic social basis, and how to stabilize, how to make a stabilizing strategic basis for continue maintaining a kind of a cooperation. So I think that to reduce the gap these days of understanding of cooperation is very important. Whether the factor of respecting the core interests should be put as a precondition for general cooperation and some specific collaboration in particular. For instance, this is very important questions nowadays we raise. Beijing obviously believes that mutual respect, the core interest, lay down the foundation for more predictable and sustainable cooperation on the converged interests. But I think that if we check Washington's position nowadays, Washington's position seems that is to confront when needed, competition when necessary, and cooperation when possible. Gives no clear answer to the question of whether a mutual respect of the core interest should be put as a precondition for a general cooperation.
Thank you very much, Chen.
So I think I will stop here, all right?
Yeah, thank you very much. So Susan, quickly turning to you, how does it look from a US perspective, what you've experienced so far with us?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Colin. And I really listened carefully to Deng Xiao's remarks, and a lot of it really does resonate with me. I think US foreign policy, frankly, is at a crossroads, and that we're finally reckoning with the end of this 30-year-long unipolar moment, seeing how damaging kind of it's been for the United States to not have a clear idea of what America's role, should be in the world for the last 30 years. And I think, our diplomacy and the, post-World War II international system have suffered for it. We're struggling now to find this footing in a world of multipolarity. Unfortunately, the US is coming from a place of diminished confidence, which is not irrelevant in the China-West dialogue context. And we really have a choice to make. Are we going to promote this simple us versus them narrative that's going to be good for our domestic politics in many cases, but will end up sort of setting out this divide in the world? Or can we take advantage of the sort of flexible groupings of capable but different countries so that we can smartly address our common challenges? And I think there's an opportunity right now to do this, but the momentum, unfortunately, is currently toward the former us versus them pattern rather than towards the latter. And I think that's obviously the wrong choice. Why do I think that's the wrong choice? Right now, every country on the planet is facing the same three urgent priority problems. The first is obviously recovering from this devastating COVID-19 pandemic. The second is helping our economies out of the crisis that came from that. And the third is this existential threat of climate change. And none of these challenges will be helped by some kind of bipolar US-China rivalry. And in fact, it's quite obvious that massive harm has already been done to the resolution of these problems by this rivalry. And all you have to do is look at this vaccine competition and the huge damage that's been done by this rivalry over the last year and a half to the WHO to see this. I think this is a choice we are making. And unfortunately, the notion that one can strengthen the international rules-based system coincident with an all-out strategic competition between the US and China, I believe will prove to be false. And this gets at what Deng Xiao was just saying about how do you construct, a relationship within which you can strengthen the international system, which China obviously has to be a part of. I mean, it's worth noting that China is completely embedded in the international system at this point. It's done a lot to get there. We've done a lot to promote it getting there, and efforts to undo this progress will be very destabilizing and will damage the interests of many countries, most importantly, the United States. So when I look at the China-West dialogue, I hope that it will do more to promote this kind of cooperative context that Deng Xiao talked about. But frankly, China is also ambivalent about inclusivity, and it has been dissatisfied with aspects of the current system, believes, as Deng Xiao just mentioned, that it is not seen as an equal, that it is not respected, and that its interests are not respected enough by others. And it's clear that China's top-down system does clash, I think we have to be honest about this, in many ways with the sort of bottom-up nature of Western systems. And neither side wants to compromise, which leads to a zero-sum game, unfortunately. In closing, I'd submit that the frame of competition, I mean, competition is a feature of the international system, but it's not the goal of the international system. In a moment where, frankly, stability is an increasingly precious commodity, I think we need to focus on promoting stability in the international system and stop focusing on what divides us or who is winning. Inclusive diplomacy as the kind of what you mentioned in the context of the China-West dialogue and in the context of these flexible groupings within the G20. I think getting a mix of countries in to help us buffer and some small countries can actually have agency to lead in some cases on some issues. This will help us in getting progress on the key issues that we face today.
Agreed. Carrie Brown, why is how it looks from Beijing a realpolitik way of looking at the world, if I can ask it that way, or say whatever you think is most important at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, very, very quickly. I mean, it's the ultimate kind of problem that you have in the next 5 to 10 years, the world's greatest practitioner of a form of capitalism being a communist country. So this has completely upended all of the usual narratives that I think the world was trundling along. And I think that's often quite kind of raised questions about us, meaning Europeans and Americans. And I suppose the reason why I'm puzzled, well, there's two reasons that I find this particular moment puzzling. The first is that I seem to remember 15 to 20 years ago, a sense that it's okay, we can deal with Chinese investment and Chinese partners coming into Europe or America because our values are strong enough to deal with that. And that seems to have gone. And it's now a kind of real sense of almost like a visceral fear. And the fear is the problem rather than what we're actually frightened of, that our feelings are often wrapped up in this. And the second, I suppose, is this weird sense in which my understanding as a European was that Enlightenment values were about pluralism. And I would have thought that in the long term, there's something important about the fact that the world seems to me to be entering into a period of profound pluralism, where you do have real differences and alternatives. And although there are sharp local issues, and I don't deny these issues are very, very difficult, and the way in which America and China in particular talk to each other is full of conflict and sharpness at the moment, and the Europeans, I think in the bigger picture, actually, this must be ultimately a good thing, that we are liberated from a monolithic narrative and we are going into, I think, a kind of period in which pluralism is not just something you say, but it's something you live and do. And to me, that's the opportunity from China, that we can become pluralists just through living through this moment, even though it's terribly, terribly challenging. Thank you.
It's interesting to note that Chen-Dong Chao, you are the author of the idea of pluralistic modernization for internal policy and politics discourse and multipolar, essentially multiple narratives in the global discourse. And that's very much reflects what Carrie's saying. Sergio Vitar, you have this daunting task of speaking for the rest of the world.
Well, let me, even for you, just say that I value very much, and I think all Latin American countries, the role of the China-West dialogue. And from a Latin American perspective, what I want to emphasize is that we are facing a major crisis which will take the next 10 years to get out. And in that sense, China appears to be the most rapid growing and innovating country for the next decade to the Pacific. So it's an essential space for us. In that sense, I would say that Latin America will be losing and harmed with confrontation. And on the contrary, would gain and benefit from economic and technological competition. And we must see the world in ways that we keep our autonomy to operate in these conditions. That's the first point. The second point, more important, is that we need to participate also, and we see very well as very interesting the possibility of a multilateral system, the plurilateralism, where other countries can participate in order to reinforce cooperation in areas like renewable energy, digitalization, scientific development, health, of course. So need for alternative narratives that explain confrontation in a way that allows cooperation. It's critical for all other countries. In that sense, also the connection with the European Union and what you mentioned about Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Draghi this morning is a good line for action. Well, that's the point, basic point, and I would say that the G20 is very critical for us. Latin America should not be passive, but we need to understand more China and not being just informed by specific and partial sources. Latin America needs to see the world with their own eyes. Thank you.
Excellent, Sergio. Well, good to be together, the five of us. We go to a chat room now, and please listen to the Kevin Rudd, Paul Martin discussion in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Good to see you all.